This week I'd like to talk to you a little about Claude Monet, the French painter, friend of the Impressionists. This is a little village that he lived and worked in for a considerable time called Veuilletoy. It's on the River Seine. He worked there with Renoir, with Monet and other painters for quite a considerable time. Here his wife died, and in the winter of the 1870s, one of the late years, I've forgotten now, 1878 I think, he painted a snow scene, many of them. He was so imbued with the spirit of painting that he drove his easel into the river ice and painted the town. I've put in here his summer painting boat, in which he had many happy hours with his wife and friends and travelled up and down the river painting each side of it. And I'd like to paint a snow scene to give some idea how he painted snow. I'm putting this relatively warm winter afternoon sky with the canvas showing through, loosely painted, not caring much at this moment for clouds and things because it's overcast. As the paint dries a little, very quickly, I can go back onto this. But now we must think of the light coming down from, let's say, 2 o'clock-ish. And this will cast on the buildings a shadow. And here the Impressionists always thought of blues in shadows, or colours generally, so that the side of each building will have a blue shadow. And the same thing prevails as in light and dark, that the intensity of the blue, of the deepness, will come close to the edge of the building like this. It's emphasized. And we calm this down after. So each of these little buildings has a blue tinted side to it. Monet had an incredible eye for color, as did all the Impressionists, in fact. He was born in 1840 in Paris and stayed there about 3 or 4 years. Then he went off to Le Havre, where his father had a grocery business, and he wanted to become a painter. Around there at this time, there was a man called Keating, Dutchman, wonderful painter, and when Monet was a young man, he painted and drew caricatures, very common in those days. And it was Keating and Keating who influenced him very strongly to become a landscape painter. Actually, his first work was as a marine artist. Unlike Renoir and others, Cézanne, Van Gogh and so on, though he did in fact stay painting as an impressionist all his life, culminating in the work on his lily pond paintings, which is some of the largest and most incredible paintings in the history of art. He achieved great fame, notoriety, wealth, until he died in 1926 at a ripe old age. During the time that Monet was down here trying to earn a living, he suffered extreme poverty. And I really mean extreme poverty. The Victorian times in Europe for the poor were very hard, and he suffered, as most painters of this time, not all painters, but a lot of them suffered privation, because apart from everything else, his work was not popular because the general public were not educated enough to realize the full potential of Impressionism. I'm killing the white in this can. It's called killing the white because it It's not necessary from the point of view of the job, it's just there to give luminosity. It still works, it's still luminous. This is almost like a watercolour technique. Because all Impressionists used white in the first instance. What appears to be a very difficult piece of painting to anyone unacquainted with it is because it takes many years to be able to go out to nature and paint. One shouldn't be discouraged by the apparent difficulty because obviously you can't expect to play the piano or violin or something like Yehudi Menuhin in 10 minutes. But it's, the main thing is, of course, practice. Is to keep and love, just practice daily, quietly paint away, teach yourself, read the books, look at the masters. And we had with the French Impressionists certainly a comradeship which was similar to our own British pre-Raphaelites, except, of course, the pre-Raphaelites were pretty well off, and the Impressionists weren't all very well off. But they not only helped each other with money, they helped each other with technique and with, as they learned something, they discussed it and made a rather wonderful evening's chat over a glass of wine or two about the day's work. They criticised each other's work and helped each other to achieve a better effect. In other words, they practiced brotherhood and worked alongside each other. And of course, Monet indeed painted a wonderful picture of Monet's painting boat. When you're at the seaside, one should look at boats and the action they take in water. You see a reflection in the water, but it's different from the one you'd expect if it was in a mirror. You see more of the reflection you imagine. And of course, if there's a ripple, you get, as in the other painting, this would come right down here. But remember, we're going to put blocks of ice in here, just to make it more interesting. Impressionism again. Yellow, a complementary colour, blue. The side, yellow, at the top of the warm blue, mauve. There's a shutter on here, a sliding panel. These are staves put in to steady the boat in the water. They would come down. This all helps the lateral, harmonious design of the picture, because it echoes, the boat echoes the verticals of the buildings. The boats, different positions, one behind the other, creating that kind of perspective, different colours to make interest. The border, edge of the riverbank comes about here. They had, I've seen from pictures, I haven't been there, platforms, obviously to keep the bank, the riverbank, of timber structures, which also have little pieces of wood up, again making a pattern, again echoing the downward feeling. And then here and there is a movement to bring us down and up into the boat. Design, think design. Allow your natural feelings to help you This helps the boats, this little bit here. Don't make it too obvious, break it up. Because you can play about with paintings forever. I've made a few little alterations to this painting off camera. This is now in a kind of blocked-in state to take a few dark accents in order to emphasize the lightness of the snow. Of course, Monet worked both on his little boat here and also out on the ice floes. He had a hot water bottle to keep his hands warm. And reminds one in a way of the early Canadian painters like Krieghoff and Paul Kane. Turner also, of course, worked outdoors. You get more beauty and truth in a few hours' work, indeed minutes' work, outside against nature than in any studio production. This is why they often produced sketchy work outside and taking the sketch back to the studio and qualifying it, and usually the sketch has much more truth in it. One of his motifs, was the Japanese print design. And of course this is lateral in conception, flat pattern, very little attempt to create the three-dimensional aspect one would obtain in a Claude Lorraine or something, but a simple flat patternish type thing. It's very difficult to obtain because one naturally, when you see depth, you have to hold yourself back from making the thing photographic, because obviously the French Impressionists were much influenced by photography. It came out, the Gour types and so on, about 1835, I think. Fox Talbot and that. The early photography, of course, influenced them much. And they tried to steer away from its effects. They used it, they actually worked from photographs in some cases. One feels that Renoir worked quite a bit from them, probably Monet less so. I don't know why I say that. I can imagine him preferring to work outdoors and obtaining the effects he could obtain by direct painting. I'm just putting a few arbitrary touches, and then we'll go on to a bit of snow painting. I'll make it a dirty snow because virgin snow is a bit boring. Whereas we imagine it's about 2 o'clock on a miserable afternoon, so there's a wan sun coming down, and therefore along here, if one places a few marks to indicate the snow, you can distress it afterwards. Just as in nature, it comes down very beautiful and melts, or people walk on it. And he has it in Monet's work, certainly, especially Krieghoff, Turner. They all use a rugged, crisp paint. I've mixed tempera with this paint to give it a rugged and crisp touch. We'd imagine there's been a heavy fall of snow, and this is one of the things the Impressionists adored, because white, which is the negation of colour, becomes magical when snow, because it's a marvellous carrier, actually, of colours. On the painting boat, this would receive here because it's closer, a more direct building up of the snow onto the foredeck and onto the roof itself, and will allow a little of the actual roof to show through in an impressionistic technique which helps the aesthetic touch. Don't want to do pure white on everything. When working out in winter and snow, one has to obtain the effect very quickly, and one of the way of snow painters is to actually physically use your canvas as a palette, because you can obviously do that quicker than feed your brush from the palette. You also get thick paint on quickly. So I'll just very quickly do some virgin blocks here, and quietly remember our broken. Of course, they piled up on moving water. They piled up, but in Monet's ice flow paintings, if you could call it that, he actually drew each block separately using a peculiar drawing colour for the edges. The drawing colour being a mauvish blue with a touch of green in it. It represents the I'll do a crude effort there. This would be reflected in the water. And it needs refining, and then another piece here and so forth. And he would use these blocks in not too an obvious fashion, thinking of a tessellated pavement in perspective, which of course would give a certain perspective going away, because remember, he did not, of course, want to achieve too much of the effect of distance, but in some of his paintings, by the use not of linear perspective, but aerial perspective, by using the warmish colours here and the cool colours up there, he obtained aerial perspective, which is, of course, much more subtle than the linear. Now, it's necessary to calm down the crude blues in here by making a relatively soft mauve colour, a kind of interspersing little dabs. If you look into the Impressionists, this is the optical mix in they talk of. Their shadows always partaken of much colour. It lends variety to what is usually quite a mundane colouring. The more you put in, killing, enlivening, qualifying, the eye is rewarded by looking into areas and seeing many colours in it. And it's a good idea, of course, to make an excuse to bring down some of the warm colours here, because it carries the colour down into the bottom part of the picture, creating more unity. Just a few touches. At this stage, the painting should be varnished. It should be dry first and varnished, of course, and then take a strong, broad brush, and with the most minute amount of a grey, which you would have to determine, you scumble it in this fashion. This is, of course, Turner's method of painting, amongst others. And what you're doing is creating an atmospheric layer of extremely fine proportions. Once you've done this, you can't easily go over it again. Now let's assume that that's reasonably covered. It doesn't have to be a flat covering, otherwise you'd use one thick coat. You want to gradate it, and here and there add a little bit extra for the suggestion of a cloud or something like this. Play around with it. One should ideally leave it until it dries, but if you've got a bit of experience, it registers. Now, this paint's a bit tacky, but the object of the operation is to drag, I shall lose a bit this picture, but it doesn't matter, is to drag this down over the dry paint to make the buildings in the back of the painting disappear into the mist, as would happen in nature. In other words, you are painting a mist onto the painting, and you can bring this down further, leaving the areas closer to you plainer. There is one thing I noticed I haven't put in that must go in. Of course, you lose these things, and that, of course, are the very important masts. You lose things as you paint. There's a bit of water here somewhere, so we put these back. I believe, yes, I believe this one had these had a lateral thing. This all helps in the composition. So it becomes a bit jollier again. You mustn't have it too desperately miserable. That's about all one can do for that. Thank you very much.
Volgende week schildert Tom Keating een portret in de stijl van Renoir.